Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Nordic Mensa Fund Intelligence Day webinar of 2023. My name is Janne Sylvest, and I am the chair of the Nordic Mensa Fund. I will just give a very brief introduction and then present our speakers for today that we are very excited to have with us. Just briefly about the Nordic Mensa Fund, for those of you who are not very familiar with us, we are a foundation that is set up to support research into the characteristics, the nature, and the uses of human intelligence, and thereby realizing one of Mensa's main purposes. It's a joint project between the national Mensa organizations of Denmark, Finland, Norway, and Sweden. And it was formally established as an independent legal entity in Sweden in 2020. This is just very briefly. You can see that Mensa has three main purposes, and to identify and foster human intelligence, to encourage research, and to provide a stimulating environment for its members. And it's the second purpose that we are focusing on here today. I should also say that we are supported financially by the Nordic Mensas, but we are also dependent on donations from others if we want to make a real impact here. So I'm going to show you here how you can give us money if you want to support us. You can pay by credit card or PayPal, or you can pay by bank transfer. If you have your phone handy, you can use the little QR code here, and it will take you straight to a link on our website. I will also, as an extra service, show this to you after the presentations, but let us get straight into today's main event. We have two speakers with us today. The first one that you will hear from is Leonardo Bonetti. He is a PhD and a researcher at the Center for Music in the Brain at the University of Aarhus in Denmark. And he will be speaking to us about the neural basis of intelligence and memory, insights from music and aging. It's a very, very exciting and interesting study that he was awarded a small grant from the foundation for in 2022. I should say, of course, we're not funding everything. Ours is a very small contribution, but we're very happy to support this kind of study, which also shows the breadth, because this is about neuroscience. And our other speaker of today is Malin Hildebrand Karlén from the University of Gothenburg in Sweden, the Department of Psychology. She's also a researcher and a clinical psychologist. And she will be talking about an entirely different kind of research into psychology, about how to measure the intelligence concept and its relationship to reality monitoring among violent offenders in early 20th century forensic psychiatric investigations. I'm very excited also to hear about this one, which takes a look at how the concept of intelligence has evolved over the years, and as the title says, how it's been used in psychiatric investigations of offenders. So without further ado, I will hand the floor over to Leonardo Bonetti, who will speak to us first. Oh, I should, remember one thing, and that is, if you have questions along the way, you can write them in the YouTube chats. They will be conveyed to me, and then I will ask those questions to our speakers today. So, Leonardo, here you go. I will stop sharing now, and you can take over. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Janne. I will share my screen in a moment. Okay, so now I should be able to see my screen, and in a moment also my presentation. If that's not the case, please let me know. I'm very happy to be here today and to present this talk. As Janne already mentioned before, I'm going to talk about some of our studies, showing some of our results on the neural basis of intelligence and memory, and also getting some insights from music and aging. So the first question that I tend to start my talk with these days is why memory, intelligence, music, and the brain? So in other words, why do we do what we do? And my answer is that investigating intelligence and memory is very important to understand the healthy human brain. And this is something that is important already in itself, but is also crucial because it's the first step to the investigation into something that doesn't work anymore with the brain. So first we try to understand the brain that works with a well functioning, and then that can help us to understand what happens when something goes wrong. So when there is an excessive cognitive decline, for instance, associated with aging, and it can also become like dementia or other kind of memory disorders. And to do that, we like very much to use music because music could turn out to be a great tool to understand complex cognitive processes such as memory and intelligence and their neurobiological substrate. And the reason why that is like that is because music is organized in hierarchical sequences of sounds, and therefore it requires several different cognitive processes to to process and to figure out what kind of meaning, what kind of musical meaning is being conveyed. And it's a universal language, or at least is more universal than other languages, especially, and this is very relevant, especially when you do studies across different countries, because what you develop in one country can be very easily exported in different countries without problems with languages. And this is a bit more technical, but it also elicits a particularly good brain signal. So with that, I will just provide you with a short overview of the studies that I want to briefly present to you today. There are three. The first one is called the Brain Spatiotemporal Dynamics of Musical Memory Recognition. And this is a study on young, healthy participants who recognize some musical sequences that they previously memorized, and then we studied their brain activity while they did this task. The second one is instead very much connected to that, but it considered the age-related decline in brain functions, and especially the age-related decline in brain functions associated with musical memory recognition. And we did that by comparing young versus older adults while they did this memory task, memory recognition task. Finally, the last study is a proper study on fluid intelligence, or IQ. So something that is very much, of course, connected and hopefully interesting for Mensa. And in this case, we directly study fluid intelligence in relation to brain functional and structural networks. So with that, I'll go straight to the first study, which is brain spatiotemporal dynamics of musical sequences recognition, long-term recognition. So in this case, we had 83 participants, which is a considerably large number of participants in cognitive neuroscience. And we used two different machines that are called magnetoencephalography, or MEG, and structural magnetic resonance, magnetic resonance imaging, MRI, that we use for acquiring structural images of the brain. These two machines look like that. And I guess you are probably familiar with the MRI because it has a lot of clinical applications, and probably most of you have been in an MRI before, at least once in your life. It's very common. And it's a great machine to get highly detailed pictures of the human body, for instance, of the brain. This is what we do in our studies. While this other machine is a little bit less known, but is extremely important for studying the brain activity. It's called MEG, as I mentioned before, and looks a little bit like a gigantic head. And it's also very nice for me to mention that because this is a machine that has seen a very big development and evolution in Finland, which is one of the countries involved in the association. And the combination of these two machines is very, very important because we can use them together to characterize very well the spatial and temporal extent of the brain signal while people perform some tasks. And this is exactly what we did in this case. And well, our experimental design in this case was one of our prototypical design, and where we have first an encoding phase where people memorize something like some music. And then we had the recognition phase where people are asked to recognize either what they memorized before or something new. And today I'm going to focus on the recognition phase. But before getting into that, just to help you to understand exactly how the task worked, I will just tell you a couple of words about the encoding phase. So in the encoding phase, people listened to a very short musical piece that I will play for you in a moment, and they were simply asked to try to memorize it as much as possible. I will now play it for you. Okay, so that was the encoding phase. People simply tried to memorize it as much as possible by simply listening to that twice. And after that, we had the recognition phase that consisted of isolating some melodies, presenting them to the participants, and asking them to rate whether the melodies were taken from the previous piece, so they were a previously memorized melodies, or if they were variations of the original melodies. And here, I'm just giving you an example of how they looked. So this was an example of the original, previously memorized musical sequence. And then we had 4 different categories of variations that were computed in a systematic manner. So even if you don't read music, you can just focus on the symbols and on the colors here. So you can probably see that the first symbol here is exactly the same in these 2 examples. That means that the first sound was exactly the same between these 2 conditions. But then in the case of variation 1, we varied all the other tones. When we had variation 2, we kept fixed the first 2 tones of the sequence, and then we changed the last 3, and so forth. We changed only the last 2 or the last one in the other 2 categories of the variation. So now we'll just play an example of these short melodies. First, a previously memorized sequence example. This was exactly the beginning of the piece that you listened to before. And then these 4 examples of the different kinds of variation. So that you could hear that some of them were more similar to the original and some others were more different. And so after that, we collected all this data for all the people, and then we did quite a lot of pre-processing and signal processing and a lot of computation. Now I will not go into detail for not bore you too much, but I will go straight to some results. What is important is that after doing all this pre-processing, we got to a point where we had 4 main regions of interest of the brain. That were the regions of the brain that were primarily active in this task, and we could then show the time series, so the activity over time of these brain regions. And this is exactly what I'm showing you today, right now, sorry, in this brain region. So just to give you an understanding of how to read this figure, this is a depiction of the brain, as you can imagine, showing the left hemisphere here, and then the right hemisphere in this other side. So on the top, you see the brain from the external part of the brain, and on the bottom, you see the internal part of the brain. So here, this is depicting basically what is called the auditory cortex in the left hemisphere, which is very important for auditory processing. And here I'm showing you this different time series, 5 different time series associated to the 5 different conditions. So in red, the previously memorized condition, and in the shades of blue and black, the different variations. Moreover, here, I'm also showing you the onset of the different tones of the melodies. And I'm also showing these graphs that indicate where in the sequence we introduce the variation. So in this case, for instance, for the condition NT1, we introduce the variation after the second tone, from the second tone. So as you may remember from before, the first tone was exactly the same across all the different experimental conditions. And as a matter of fact, there is absolutely no difference in the brain response, which is great. Then we introduced the variation in one case at the tone number 2, in this light blue case. And what happened is that just after 150 milliseconds after this sound, so very, very early, we got this stronger negative response only for this introduced variation. And after that, we got this reduction in this other positive response afterwards. And interestingly, this is something that happened systematically every time we inserted a variation. So when we inserted the variation here, we got this negative response first, and then we didn't get this positive response up here, and so forth. This is something that happened systematically, showing 2 different things at the same time. So the variation was associated to this negative brain signal, which we call prediction error signal in the brain, because it's showing that there is a variation in a melody that was previously memorized. And then while instead the melody was not varied, so was not changed, it was still original, we got these positive components up here, one for each of the tones. So basically 2 different processes, one indexing the variation and one indexing the recognition of the original melodies. When we move forward to another brain region, which is a brain region related, so strongly related to the hippocampus, which is a region in the brain which is particularly relevant for memory, we observe something similar, but even more clear. So every time we inserted a variation, we got a negative response first, and then we didn't get the positive response up here. And this is something that happened systematically for all the colors, so for all of our conditions. While up here, we only got the response for the conditions where we didn't introduce the variation. Something that is also very relevant and interesting, although maybe not very easy to see in this particular plot, is that when you see the latency of this negative peak for the auditory cortex or for the hippocampus, we could see that in the auditory cortex, the latency was 150 milliseconds. So the peak occurred after 100 milliseconds from the sound, while in this case was approximately 250 milliseconds from the sound. So there was a time lag of approximately 100 milliseconds, which has been then tested with some computational modeling and suggested very strongly that there is a communication between these 2 brain regions. And first, the auditory cortex is processing this difference and then is sending signals to these other brain regions here to kind of complement this processing of the information. And this happened both for the variations here with the negative responses and also for the recognition of the original sequences in these positive responses up here. Moreover, this is something that happened in the left hemisphere, as you can see, the left hemisphere of the brain. And then we got something very, very similar. So it got a little bit faster in this case, in the right hemisphere. So also here in the right hemisphere, auditory cortex, we didn't really get the negative peaks down here in this case, but we got the positive peak for the recognition of the previously memorized sequences. And well, we got something very similar also in the right hemisphere hippocampus. So in this case, we got the negative peaks as well, as we show in the left hippocampus, and then the positive peaks up here for the conditions that was previously memorized. So the question is now, why is this relevant? And well, it's relevant, I think, because we describe the brain spatiotemporal dynamics of the recognition of previously learned music, so the original melodies, but we also show the prediction errors that were elicited by the variation of music. So in other words, we now know quite well what happens in the brain when you recognize previously memorized music or variations of those previously memorized music. This is very important also because it's not just music. I mean, music is a tool to understand the brain. So by using music, we gain insights into how the brain is able to process information over time. And this is something that can be translated into a more general understanding of the brain. Moreover, the other very important thing, as I was telling you in the beginning of the talk, is that we obtain a sort of solid baseline of the healthy brain when you do this kind of task that can be used to investigate further memory decline in aging and also potentially in clinical populations. And as a matter of fact, this is one of the this is the project that got some funding from the Nordic Mensa Fund. And what we did in this case was basically proceed and recruit some more participants. In this case, we had 40 older participants, older than 60 years old, mean age of 67, and 37 new young participants that were all younger than 25 years old. And we use exactly the same paradigm as before, with MEG and MRI and the same kind of experimental paradigm. And this brings us to the results of the second section of the second study. And here I will show you just the results for 2 key brain regions that show very interesting differences between young and older adults. So first, this region that I showed you before, so basically the hippocampal region in the right hemisphere of the brain. And this is shown independently for the previously memorized musical melodies and for 2 categories of the variations. The variation when we introduce the variation from tone number 2 and then all the way, and then the variation where we introduce the variation at tone number 4. And here you see 2 different time series, in red, the young people, and in blue, the older adults. What you can see very interestingly is that we still got, as I showed you before, a positive peak in this case for all the tones that built the musical melody. But in this case, the young participants were associated with a much stronger peak than the older adults. While when we introduce the variation, we observe a similar phenomenon, but reversed in polarity. So when we introduce the variations, basically, there was a negative response for each of the tones that was much stronger for the young compared to the older adults. And this is something that is even more evident when introducing the variation at tone number 4. As you can see here, there's a very negative peak that is much stronger for the young, so for the red line compared to the older adults. That's quite interesting, and would also suggest something that maybe was very expected, like, okay, people get older, and then there is some cognitive decline in that, and so the memory processes became a bit worse, and so there is less activity in the brain. So that's quite expectable in a way. And this is good, but we also observe something a little bit more interesting and challenging in a way. So when you focus on the left auditory cortex, so this region here of the brain, something else happens. So in this case, we still got, well, one positive peak for each of the tones, as I showed you before. But in this case, this peak is stronger for the blue line, which correspond to the older adults. So that shows that it's not that all the brain regions are just declining when people get older, but there is a sort of transformation of the dynamics of the brain. So this region, like the hippocampal region, very important for memory, is kind of showing a decline, but the auditory cortices, mainly related to the first elaboration of the sounds, is actually showing an increase. And this is something that is very relevant because it's showing that there are some kind of differences in these quite complex brain mechanisms underlying aging and memory processes. And with that, I want to go straight to the last study, which is instead a study that doesn't talk anymore about memory and in general complex cognitive processes associated to memory, but that focuses directly on fluid intelligence, or intelligence that we would measure with IQ tests. So basically the tests that are necessary for entering the Mensa Association. And in this case, we collected another data set, and we had 2 different groups of participants. High GF, where GF stands for for fluid intelligence, and average fluid intelligence measured with the IQ. And as you can see here, the high intelligent people were 117 IQ in terms of average, so not like the Mensa level, but still significantly higher than the average that was pretty much the average of the population, so around 100 in IQ points. And what we did in this case was using, again, the same machines as before, so the MRI and the MEG, but we did things a little bit different in this case. So we got, pictures of the brain from the MRI to study the structural connections between brain regions in the brain of high and average intelligent people. While for the MEG, we didn't study any task. So there was no memory recognition, no memory tasks in this case, but we simply had their brain activity at rest. So people were in the MEG without doing anything for about 10 minutes, and that's it. And after that, what we did was studying what is called connectivity. And connectivity in the brain refers to how much different brain regions are connected. And this can refer either to structural connections that we got from the MRI or to functional connections from the MEG. I'll just give you a little bit more information about that so that you can better understand this. In a very simple way, the structural connectivity refers to the thickness of the proper structural physical connections between different brain regions. While for the functional brain regions, the thing is a little bit more complex. So the way to derive functional connectivity in the brain is as follows. You got the different brain regions, and you measure the activity over time of these different brain regions. And then you see how much over time these different brain regions are characterized by a similar activity. So in other words, if a pair of brain regions is shows a strong correlation, then these 2 brain regions are highly well correlated and so highly connected. If the correlation is low, then it's close to 0, you have a very low level of connectivity. And another thing that is very important is that when you do that, with MEG, what you can do is that you can get not just one main time series, but you can filter the time series and you can get 5 different frequency bands. So 5 different extents of the frequency of the signal. So basically you can study the connectivity at the structural level and in 5 different bands at the functional level. And once you get the functional or structural network of the brain, then you can see how that differs in people who are highly intelligent or average intelligent. And now I will show you these differences, but first I want to just show you something more general across all participants. So this is some plotting related to the structural connectivity. These are 3 different ways of showing basically the same information. We can start from this one, which is a bit easier to understand. As you can, I guess, easily imagine, this is a brain template. And this is basically the brain from the top, while this is an image of the brain from the left side. And what you can see is that there are different connections between different brain regions. And when the connections are bigger, are thicker, that means that the actual physical connections between those brain regions were also thicker in real life. While when they were thinner, like you can see here, these connections or these ones here, those were connections that were still relevant, but much thinner. And you can also plot that in a schema ball like that, or in a matrix like this. And something that is very important is that of plotting them in a matrix like this, is that this can help us to better visualize one key measure that we can derive from this structural network of the brain. And this measure, which is the only measure that I want to show you today, although we calculated actually a bit more measures than that, this measure is called degree. And the degree refers to basically the amount of connectivity from between one brain regions and all the other brain regions in the brain. So in other words, if one brain region is very much connected to all the other regions in the brain, then you would have a very high degree. If that brain region is not very much connected, you would have a low degree. And you can see that in this matrix, because here what we are plotting is all of our brain regions here and here. And then you see how each brain region is connected with each other brain region. So for instance, if you go to the brain region number 16, like here, for instance, you will see that this brain region was very much connected with these 2 brain regions up here, as you can see from these red dots and so forth. So in other words, if you have an horizontal line that is very red, that brain region has a very high degree. And we did that both for the structural connectivity, but also for the functional connectivity in the 5 different frequency bands that I mentioned before. So very slow frequency bands between 0, 1, and 2 hertz, up to a very fast band between 32 and 74 hertz. So basically we had 6 different connectivity networks in the brain that we could examine and that we could extract the degree from, and that we could compare between highly and average intelligent individuals. And this is exactly what we did. And let me show you first information about the structural connectivity and the degree associated to that. So here you see in this plot the degree associated to all the brain regions for the highly intelligent individual or for the average intelligent individual. As you can see here, it doesn't look like the difference is very big. However, when you subtract each pair of brain regions from between the high and the average intelligent individuals, you get these distributions of the difference. And you can see that the distribution is not just around 0, as you would have if you don't have any kind of real significant difference, but you instead see that most of the brain regions, or at least a significant number of brain regions, is positive, showing that a significant number of brain regions has a stronger degree for the highly intelligent individual than for the average intelligent individual. And when you plot these regions in a brain template like that, you see that there are these frontal brain regions up here, and then also these other regions in this medial temporal lobe. So in other words, what we are seeing here is that at the structural level, there is a significantly enhanced number of connections in the brain of highly intelligent individuals compared to the average intelligence individual. When we do the same at the functional level, investigating separately the different frequency bands, something interesting emerged, because for the very low frequency band, there is basically no difference between the 2 groups. Then when you go instead to slightly higher frequency bands, like this one, to 8 hertz, you see that the difference between the two groups is positive across most of the regions of interest of the brain, showing that on a functional level in this frequency band, there is more connectivity, more connections between the brain regions for the highly intelligent individual. Interestingly, the same or even stronger occurs for the 8-12 Hertz band. And even if that's not very strong, something similar happened also for 12-32 Hertz. So a little bit like what happened when comparing young and older adults, also here, maybe this is not very surprising because it's kind of intuitive that people who are more intelligent probably have a stronger connectivity in the brain, because a stronger connectivity in the brain probably facilitates a higher amount of information flow between the brain regions. So this is a very interesting result, but it is a result that perhaps we could easily expect. Something instead definitely less, more surprising, something that was very relevant, I think, is that when you instead inspect the highest frequency band of them all, so between 32 and 74 Hertz, what you see is the other direction of the result. So basically, the average intelligent individual had a stronger connectivity among almost all of the regions in the brain. And this is extremely important because this suggests that the picture is a bit more complex. It's not that highly intelligent people are just characterized by higher level of connectivity in the brain, but there is a sort of differentiation between different frequency bands. So in other words, higher structural connectivity, higher connectivity in lower frequency bands, but then when it comes to very high frequency band, you get stronger connectivity in the average intelligent individual. And this is something that is quite relevant and interesting because it shows new advances on the neurobiology of intelligence. So with that, I just draw some conclusions and future perspectives because my time is almost up. So we basically discovered the fast scale activity and communication between some key brain regions like the auditory cortices and the hippocampus, especially during the recognition of temporal sequences like the musical melodies, and especially during the recognition of the previously memorized musical melodies. And then we also studied that in the aging population, and we saw that the aging is a complex phenomenon that is associated with increased activity in the left auditory cortex, but reduced activity in the right hippocampus and inferior temporal cortex. So it's not just a matter of declining. And then, as I mentioned a couple of minutes ago, highly versus average intelligent people have an overall higher structural connectivity in the brain. So more structural connections in the brain, and also stronger functional connectivity in these lower frequency bands, but reduced connectivity in the gamma band, so the highest frequency band of the brain. And this also suggests that most likely these different frequency bands are very important for different processes in the brain. And so let's say the highly optimized brain, or the brain of people who are highly intelligent, is a brain that has this dissociation between lower frequency bands and higher frequency band in terms of connectivity. So now one of the last point of my talk is, why is this relevant again? And what next? So like coming back to the first question that I had in the beginning of my talk. And well, this is relevant because first we understood more about the brain, which is of course very important in itself. Now we can also use this knowledge and techniques and experimental paradigms to better study disorders affecting memory and intelligence, like dementia, or in general, whatever kind of disorders of memory and cognitive processes. So with that, I thank all my colleagues and all my students for helping me with this in Aarhus at the Center for Music in the Brain, and also in Oxford, this is my other affiliation. And then I'm very grateful to the Nordic Mensa Fund for contributing into financing this part of this research that I presented you today. And then, of course, I also thank all the other foundations that provided very important support. With that, I also thank all of you for listening to this talk. And if you are curious about the papers related to these specific studies, you can easily download them by using these free QR codes. They are all free access, so you can easily get them without paying anything. And if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Leonardo. This was very interesting. we haven't got any questions yet from YouTube, but I have a couple of questions that came to me while you were speaking. First of all, I'll take the last one because I found it very interesting that you had these different results in the different frequency bands. Do we know anything about, what happens in these different frequency bands? Are there different sort of functions of those bands?
Sure. Well, the different frequency bands have been associated to many different cognitive processes. So, for instance, very high frequency bands tend to be very much related to processing in very small sections of the brain, very small subnetworks of the brain, while the lower frequency bands are usually associated with higher, in some cases with higher level cognitive processes in the brain. Although there are also some controversial evidence about that. But what I can say is that in this case, we could see very clearly that these lower frequency bands seem to be very relevant for the long range connections in the brain. So like lower frequency bands seem to be very important for long distance communications between brain regions, while this higher frequency band seem to be much more relevant for the communication within the small subnetworks of the brain. So in a way, the reason why the degrees, which is this amount of connectivity within the whole brain, is lower in a highly intelligent individual for this high frequency band, it could explain the fact that highly intelligent individual may have a more optimized processing of information within the subnetworks of the brain. So they are using a more optimized configuration of this high frequency compared to the lower intelligent individual. Of course, we cannot prove that completely, but that's the interpretation from this study.
Of course, I mean, I'm also sure that there will be more research to be done in that field. I also found it interesting that the first study you were talking about, where you saw that the basically, as I understood it, that the younger research subject or participants responded more strongly to the variations. Is that correct?
Yes, I just go back.
Yeah.
Well, yes, the younger participant responded more strongly to the variation. Absolutely correct.
Yeah, I was just wondering, and this may be, completely outside the frame, but I was thinking here that older people who have lived longer have been exposed to more variations, as you might put it, overall.
Yes.
So it might, you could have a theory that they would have less of a reaction to it because they've heard a lot more different things throughout their lives. Is that something that's relevant, or is it?
This is something that could be possible. Of course, it's a possible interpretation. What we think is most likely to happen in this case is that there is simply a reduction in the brain functioning, in the overall brain functioning, and it seems that reacting to variation is something that decline much more in the brain than reacting to what you already know, what you previously memorized. This could also, potentially explain, at least in part, the reason why older adults tend to be much more comfortable with familiar information that they learned in the past, or also information that they learned recently, compared to novelty, compared to variations of information that they already had. So like novel information that conflicts with what they already know. This is a little bit of a stretch, of course, but this may be one of the neurobiological mechanisms, very like at the core of this phenomenon, potentially.
Yeah, thank you. We have a question from one of our YouTube watchers. Did you check if the brain activity during the test of musical memory was different for professional musicians? I don't know if you had any professional musicians, but maybe trained musicians.
Yes, this is a very good question that we most likely people ask us. Well, not really in this case. We didn't have people with much musical expertise, but in the past we did other studies that were quite similar with musicians, and we know that musicians tend to respond more to these musical tasks, but especially when the musical tasks are very simple and when the brain response is automatic. in a case like this one, the musical training is not really that much a predictor of the brain responses. While, for instance, other cognitive abilities like working memory or IQ in general tend to be much better predictors of the brain activity, suggesting that this musical memory task is primarily a cognitive task, which is much better for indexing cognitive processes like memory and also intelligence compared to expertise or long-lasting training.
Yeah, that is super interesting. That music is sort of the universal language, so to speak. It is not something that's learned in the same way. Anyways, I think these were the questions for now. Thank you very much for a super interesting talk, and I'm sure that we will be interested to follow this in the future as well. I hope you'll stick around, because there might be others that come along, and then I think we will call on Malin, Hildebrand, Karlén, to talk about her study, which is something completely different, but I think equally interesting. So we will be very interested to hear about that. Go ahead.
Thank you so much.
Malin.
Thank you so much. Then I'll start up the PowerPoint here. Doesn't quite want to share everything here.
Well, we can see you. We can see the slides. I think you just need to show them.
Yeah, it's the full screen mode.
Exactly.
So now I think I've got it. Well, thank you so much for the opportunity to come here and present my research. This is one of the many projects that we are currently doing in my research group at the Forensic Medical Board in Gothenburg in Sweden. I will talk about one of these studies, or more particular two, that the Nordic Mensa Fund has been able to help us with. So I'm going to talk about the intelligence concept over time. How has it changed, and how to measure it? Because in forensic psychiatric investigations, which I work in, both as a researcher and as a clinician, intelligence is of huge importance, and it has always been. So how to study how the intelligence concept has evolved over time within these is a very, they present a very standardized format, actually. So it's perfect for doing some comparative historical research. First, just quick about me. I'm an associate professor at the Department of Psychology at the University of Gothenburg in Sweden, and I'm also a clinical psychologist, as I said, at the and I have a specialist degree in addiction psychology and in forensic psychology. And for this project, actually, I needed a bit more help. So I had one of my co-workers, which he is called Jakob Svedberg, and he helped me a lot with this project. And he is specialized in, he has an expertise in assessment, in cognitive assessment. So we did some work at this project. But as you all presumably know, intelligence is a core concept when it comes to the law. And in Sweden, at least since the 12th century, in landskapslagarna, there was exemptions from punishment when a person was deemed in some way, for various reasons, not only intellectual ones, but also what we now term psychosis or other kinds of really gross in the terms of big intellectual alterations of various kinds, like dementia or schizophrenia, hallucinations, delusions, those kinds of issues. But now in this project, we have focused exclusively on intelligence and what intelligence is. How do we relate intelligence? What is intelligent behavior to a group of violent offenders from the 1940s, which I'm gonna tell you about here in detail. So what is impaired enough to be exempt from punishment in the 1940s? And I'm gonna show you how this overlaps and not overlap with today's concept. So I'm gonna term it stability and instability over time when it comes to intelligence. So certain kinds of areas have always been measured, always been used when we want to exempt someone from punishment, but in other areas, I think you're going to be surprised regarding some of these areas. But I'm just going to dive right into it because we have little time and much results here. First of all, this project is a bit bigger than the data I'm going to talk about today. I've also looked at the 1830s old journals, but today we're going to focus on the 1940s. And when it comes to the aims of these studies that I'm going to run through today, we wanted to investigate how intellectual functioning was measured in forensic psychiatric examinations from the 1940s. So which tests, which subscales, which measures, what kind of concept are they trying to capture in the 1940s? Which is relevant to determine whether this individual should be exempt from punishment. So we wanted to describe how the assessment overall, I'm going to separate testing, which is like conducting the actual test, from the assessment, which in more overall gathering of information. Testing is included in the assessment, but we also have several other information sources that we use for the assessment. And this is the same that we are doing today in the 2020s. We use tests, but we also use a lot more of information sources to be able to tell something about the general intellectual functioning and its relevance to the crime the person has committed. And we wanted to compare these, yes. I'm gonna also illustrate for you today here which areas of these cognitive measures and assessment from the 1940s that can be relevant today based on DSM-5. And also I'm gonna make some reference to current directions and rules when it comes to not rules, recommendations from care organizations today on how to measure intellectual capacity within psychiatric care. So first of all, we have some definition issues when it comes to intelligence when we look at the 1940s. We have looked at all the FPIs, forensic psychiatric investigations, that's an acronym for that, from the 1940s. Between 42 to 49, 36 different FPIs, persons that were undergoing an FPI, had a diagnosis relating in some way to intellectual disability, what we would call today intellectual disability. And as you can see in this little square down here, we have several different terms for this, and also a form of, we had intellectual inferiority, it's a common term, dullness of mind, we're finding that quite a bit, and also oligophrenia. All these relate to intellectual disability, what we would term intellectual disability to various degrees. And we also have a kind of scale when it comes to which to gravity of the problem. We have debility, which the person needs a special class, or term also a backward child. I've just copied in I think it's a dissertation from the 1911s from where it's described how these special classes could work for those backward children who doesn't seem, the term is related to, they doesn't seem to move forward, would be actually a more accurate term when you look at the definition or the descriptions, because they don't tend to learn from the class that they're in, so they need to stay one more year behind. And that was like the definition used here. So, but also in the level below that, with persons with lower intellectual capacity, they were termed educable, so to speak. They could learn stuff. And they were, in more diagnostic term, is also often called imbeciles, and that imbecility. And on the level below that, it was idiocy, where they termed that they were non-educable. No matter how much you tried to teach this person to do simple tasks, they didn't learn it. And then we have the dullness of mind, or oligophrenia, and there we can actually see some notes back to, I like swished through this journal from the 1830s, where we have oligophrenia also, kind of where there's a the person sits and stares. It doesn't like partake in what happens around them. So we have like a scale. It's very poorly defined, these levels, but I've given you some notion here. So this is all it was 36 FPIs conducted at this prison, Härlanda prison. I actually was there this Thursday with one of my daughters, who played soccer at the field next to, because this is culture house now. But it was a functioning prison for 90 years. And during this time in the 1940s, they produced these FPIs at this point. So I'm going to talk about both quantitative results and qualitative results that we had from this study. So I'm going to first start with what kind of tests were used in these FPIs. And we have, oops, there. We both had like intelligence, so-called batteries, would we call them today, when we look at the Wechsler scales today. We have, in the 1940s, they had point scale, and they had something that they call Volén or Volén scale, various terms in the FBI. And we also had Terman and Terman Merrill. And in this sample of the 36 FPIs that we looked at, we had a range from point scale of an age of intelligence, as it's termed. It's both IQ and intelligence age. So O is in intelligensålder in Sweden. So we had an measured intelligence age of between 6.6 years of age. And when you measure it but determine, it was 8.10 years of age. So you see here it differs just by using different tests. And we have point scale with the highest score with 15 to 16 years of age. So we have actually a huge span if we just go on this years of age way of interpreting intelligence. And the highest IQ that was measured in this sample of 36 persons who all got this diagnosis of intellectual disability of various kinds, as you saw in the previous scale, they actually had an IQ of 88 plus mean 2.5 points. So this standardized score of 88, it's actually, I would say that it's quite high and a bit above the previous cutoff of 75 IQ, as was termed in the previous in DSM-4 and other diagnostic manuals. For like, you have to have an IQ below 75 to be able to put this a diagnosis related to intellectual disability. So when you look at the 1940s, at least on paper, when you look at IQ, there were individuals who actually had a considerably higher score, but nevertheless got a diagnosis. And just to take you through a little bit about what is in these measures then, what kind of intelligence or functions are we actually trying to capture in the 1940s here? And it's a lot, as you can see when you read through this, it's a lot about memory. It's and it's not just working memory, as we maybe think about intelligence testing today. It's episodic memory. It's more crystallized form of memory, or how to use that. So and different kinds of analogies. We have some examples here. The arm is related to the elbow as the leg is related to the, and then the person is supposed to say something here. And we have 6 of these questions. So it's, and based on how these questions are posed, I would say that my impression from these tests, they are very difficult. It's a high level of verbal capacity that is needed to be able to interpret these tests. So I'm kind of, we have a lot more adaptation today to different things that we know about intellectual disability and handling language and complex and abstract reasoning, etc. So, but I'm gonna come back to this. This is just to give you some sort of overview. I won't have time to move through all this and describe these because we will be here forever. But we have we have a clear emphasis on memory tests and verbal learning, and very little on perceptual intelligence. I'm going to come back to that later. And here's another one of these test batteries that was almost always used on everyone, not only the 36 that we looked at here. It's the most basic or most used test when it comes to testing in forensic psychiatric investigations in the 40s. And when it comes to Volén, then, Volén was a psychiatrist who actually translated point scale a couple of years before he devised his own scale. And his definition of intelligence, you can see here that regarding the memory aspects, the focus on memory, the extent and differentiation of the test subjects' total accumulated memories. But it wasn't just to measure how much memories or how much knowledge has this person stored. It must be that the person is supposed to show the tester how he or she knows the answer. And what is, the test is used to activate this knowledge, and that person is saying it back to you so that you know how this person can make use of his or her memories. As you can see here, regarding norms, it was, we wouldn't use these today, so to speak. We have 50 girls and 50 boys between 7 to 13 years of age, which would be some kind of norm relating to what is normal intelligence beyond the 30 years of age. And then they have different degrees there. And then we have 100 persons from military service, which was supposed to capture the adult levels. So we have 50 questions in 8 groups, and there was some overlap, as you can see, with point scale. We have differences between 2 items. What is the difference between a piece of glass and a piece of ice? And the person will use their memories, dive back into their memories, and describe this to the tester. And we have similarities between 3 items. They were given 3 items, and look at how do these all have in common. Abstract concepts, it's describing these, and critique of absurdities could be a sentence that doesn't make sense, and the person was supposed to put his finger on that is wrong. So Volén actually suggested a level where you would be unable to stand trial, which was a point between 25. But it is also clear that this cutoff is not used that way when it comes to the praxis in FPIs. And there are persons, I think, with 35 or over who are nevertheless deemed unable to stand trial. So not so clear cut. But this is just the tip of the iceberg. The tests were numerous and not particularly, there was no standardized batteries for which test do you use. They put it together based on what they thought they needed. But the test batteries that like point scale and Volén was one of them was almost always used. Sometimes both. It was very extensive testing actually. But we have tests of memory of various forms. This is just an example. And then we have tests of attention and concentration. We have processing of stimuli, and we have tests of general knowledge with just trivia questions. But a lot of like Swedish, what's the name of the Archbishop in Stockholm? Like that was a general knowledge questions that everyone was supposed to know. And moral judgment, it's an interesting area that we will come back to soon. We have ethical judgment and ethical concepts, which was also tests that was almost always included in these forensic psychiatric investigations. I'm going to show you now an empty sample of how these how it looked to the tester who was supposed to fill out this. Time was taken here, as you can see, can note time and the person's solution to the issue. Here we have that says window, fönster. So the person is supposed to complete the word by thinking, what does this word look like, and put the correct word. Put the correct letters in those. And then we have these jumble long words, which I personally find hideously hard, actually. It's you're supposed to look at them, and then the brain will like sort them out for themselves. And after a while, actually, when you read through it for a couple of, it falls into place. But it's long words and very complicated, I would say. So it's a kind of high difficulty level on this. And this is supposed to also complete the proverbs. It's bättre tiga än illa tala. It's better to hold your mouth shut than say something bad. So if you knew proverbs, you would be in a very much better position to be able to see this quickly. And of course, if you would be able to read, this would be considerably easier, or had a huge vocabulary. Of course, it would be much easier. So this is something actually, something else that was included, and very, very important. I need to, and I've included it here, even though it's a bit, I think it's difficult to show these kinds of images because it's a person who has been, you're talking about a person here. It's you really get a feeling for the seriousness of the situation here, actually, when you see that they have sent letters to almost everyone that the person has known in their childhood. This is from an old teacher that the person had. I think for this person, it's a question of 20 years earlier, or 15 to 20 years earlier, that this person went to school. And this teacher actually can say all these things about this person. He can look it up in his papers and can see what is the grades, how did he think about this person. It's very interesting. I really think so. So it's how many days were this person absent from school, and was it okay to be absent, or was it not okay to be absent that day? So it's extremely nuanced when it comes to those kinds of reference reports. So that is a huge part of the assessment also. The testing is definitely not everything when it comes to the 1940s here. And then we have the Bourdon test, where it's supposed to be crossing the D's. You read through the story and the cross of the D's as quickly as you can. So that is an attention test. And here's one of the ethical tests, one of the more the areas that we are interested in as researchers, because this is what we are kind of worried about when it comes to, this is something that we don't want repeated. So when it comes to intelligence, ethical concepts was a huge part of this. It was meshed into the idea of what is intelligent behavior. You're talking about viljeliv, will life, so what, and the driftsliv, what are the driving forces in this person's life, And that is supposed to be related to these kind of ethical tests. So by doing ethical tests, they are, and asking persons about ethical concepts and ethical judgments, they are building an image of this. So this is supposed to, you need to arrange your ethical, you are given ethical dilemmas or ethical hard ethical transgressions, and the person is supposed to rate these. So abandon your fiance when you had, you know that she is pregnant, and this is then the person's answer underneath here. I've chosen to leave one of them for one or two of them for you to read because it's so generic, so it's not at all possible to identify anything. But if you look at this one, to steal a loaf of bread when you're hungry and doesn't have money, well, you can always beg instead of stealing. So that is like the least bad thing here. But to poison an old relative that you're supposed to inherit, this person is actually answering something like, I've never done that, so I don't know about that. But not going into specifics there. But these kinds of answers, it's kind of telling or common when it comes to this group. To murder or rob someone when you know you can't be discovered, or then the person answers, you don't want to like do that. No, that is, no, you don't. But that is one of the most common answers in this group, and that's very, very wrong. That's principally wrong. And the persons in this group rarely like lifts up and tells about own reflections. So it keeps mostly to principles. And this person has a diagnosis of imbecilitas gravis, so they are actually termed, like in the degree area or the degree ladder that I presented earlier, they are educable, so to speak. The person is deemed able to learn stuff, but it's kind of a severe condition. So, well, not as much as others in the same category. So those were the quantitative results. Now we're looking at the more overarching qualitative results. Which kind of areas were important? Then we delved into the text and we found these themes. For assessment when it comes to like intellectual capacity and relationship to whether this person was or wasn't deemed unable to accept responsibility for his actions. They looked into early life, a lot of reference to harmful environment when they were children, genetics always, like all in the family also have some kind of intellectual deficiency, disability, blah, 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 several terms in that area. Often alcohol addiction of some kind, not working, or that was also considered an important genetic contribution or harmful contribution. Another theme was working life, the lack of work ability, like a person wants to work, but they are not able to understand what is required of them. So they don't do anything like useful in the working place. So, and the work ethic was also another area. We'll come back to that later. And the social life was also often highlighted with, as they termed it, deviant expressions, deviant impressions on others, and the need of assistance from others in everyday life. And also the last theme, in lack of better translation, is mental life. In Swedish, it's soul, själsliv, soul life. So it's always like comes back to this inferior psychological constitution that is used as an argument for why this person shouldn't be considered responsible for his crime. But the early life was that in terms that often included the signs of a failing body. Something was wrong with the person's look. These persons were measured in every way imaginable: the head, the difference between the eyes, the eye color, every measure on the body, and also just general impressions, which unfortunately is very not very nice today when you look at them. It says deviant and inferior, and you wouldn't dream of using these words in an FPI today. But it's to measure the body, and the body was very important, and this group is very focused on when it comes to like body measurements, and to prove that this inner disability, intellectual disability, actually is shown in this exterior. So that is actually much of the other stuff that I've been talking about in the quantitative aspects. It's also reflected, it was reflected in these teams, but this failing body aspect wasn't. So that was why I talked a bit more about that now. But there was, here to this theme, we had these abnormalities in early developmental history, and the person hadn't been able to go to school in the same year as everybody else and stay longer in school. And we also had this other theme that's called working life. We had lack of the ability to work. As I said earlier, they were willing, but not able. They wanted to, but had to be helped all the time in the workplace. The other sub-theme here, and the more dark one, so to speak, is a lot of talk about work ethics. They don't want to work. They are, blah, blah, they are, it's a lot of negative wordings relating to this person's laziness, and also parasiting on others. And also we have this social life, we have deviant expressions and a need for help. And we had a lot of sub-themes here, but as I see the time is running short, so I'll just summarize this in terms that this person gives a weird social impression. He or she does not respond socially as he or she should, and it's apparent to teachers, other inmates, to the clinician, to everyone. And this impression is stable. It's always the same kind of deviant expression that this person is giving. So the social life could be summed up in that. And there we have also the last theme. We have the mental life. That could be summed up in the terms of the person doesn't seem to have a clear will of his or her own. It's often led by others or easily influenced. And also, since a lot of this group actually was the violent crime, the work that had been committed was some kind of sexual crime, often against children. So that was probably why, or it was why this theme was so often mentioned, that the person did not express his sexuality towards other adults, but towards children, because the person, as they put it, was more as a child themselves. So that was like an argument used also for this inferior psychological conditions. So we had these, when it comes to, okay, how do we then understand these in test results and all this information when it comes to this criminal insanity issue that we're supposed to do this FPI for? Well, we had the measured IQ levels was considered, definitely, and also whether the test results were consistent over several tests. A lot of testing was done, but perhaps perhaps it was a question of bad norming, and then they know that the norms weren't that good, but if they considered several tests and the person had a similar results overall, then it could be trusted more. So I think that is an interpretation on my part, but that could be an example on why so many tests were made, actually. And this is kind of a another circular reasoning that you often saw in these FPIs, that crime is a symptom of inferiority and inferiority is cause of crime. So it's kind of a circular discussion when it comes to these issues. I can see that time is running out. I'm sorry. But perhaps we have 3 more minutes. Is that okay, Janne?
Yes, that's absolutely fine. I mean, I think it's better that you finish your presentation and then cut it too short. So
yeah, I'm almost done.
That's fine.
Thank you so much. Okay. Today, when it comes to these measurements in FPIs, we are doing it at the Forensic Medical Board at the Department of Forensic Psychiatry. And this, we are using DSM-5, and we are using the Wechsler Intelligence Scale. There we are. So according to DSM-5, we should be looking at deficits in intellectual functions and deficits in adaptive functioning. And these deficiencies must have been apparent during the developmental phase. So that is our very, very broad framework when it comes to diagnosing intellectual disability. And then, of course, there are several different criteria that we need to consider. And for this, for the purpose of this talk, I think that you should notice that we have a cognitive domain, we have a social domain, and we have a practical domain. So we have this cognitive domain, which is kind of it's testing and it's reference also provide information here. And we have the social domain. We can also measure some aspects of these. We have tests for these too, but mostly we use the WISE, the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale. So, and as you can see here, the WISE is also this kind of battery with several different core subtests. But what is important to, I think it's the next image. Yes, here. I will show you the overlap between WISE and the tests of the 1940s when it comes to content. As you can see kind of quickly from this, we have the verbal image index with a lot of tests in the 40s that relates to verbal functioning. And but in the perceptual, we have almost nothing. We have some complete the picture, like draw a square and rhomb and defect drawings, which is like a face and without a nose, and then you're supposed to say, okay, it's missing a nose. So it's the perceptual is very, very poorly represented. And as you can see today, and when you look at other tests of intelligence, this is very important. And we also have these, as I said previously, regarding memory. A lot more memory tests in the 1940s. These aren't included in this table because this is like the WISE different indexes here. So, but we have the digit span, some working memory tests, and we also have this little attention aspect when a symbol cross out. But since that is not so that is not always used and included in the standard WISE testing, and the speed aspect of it is not included. But in the 1940s, almost everything was done on time. So you kind of got a feeling of the person's speed when it comes to solving tasks. And these areas are not longer in FPI as part of the overarching assessment when it comes to intellectual disability. We don't consider whether this person has a high work moral or not anymore. And we don't consider this mental life or whether the person is doesn't have any regret or shame for the thing that they do. It's not, which was a huge deal in the 1940s. And also sexuality is, of course, we have a lot less emphasis on that than they did in the 1940s. So my last image here, general changes in FPI intelligence assessment. You can see a focus shift in intelligence tests from crystallized to fluid. That is at least my interpretation. The ability to use memories versus processing new information and using intelligence in a creative way. And we also have some stable aspects. We still look at vocabulary, and that's included in the VICE, and we include information and knowledge. Who was Cleopatra? That's one of the questions when it comes to from one of the subtests in VICE. And that is kind of interesting, I think, because it's still kind of, as I relate down here, it's to know who Cleopatra is, it requires some kind of learning, it requires some kind of attention in specific subjects, etc. So I think we have some kind of covertly included of more exquisite tastes or knowledge in certain areas, which we relate to more finer aspects of life, or more nuanced. It's more difficult, it's more advanced. And of course, we also have this Anglo-Saxon aspect, since we have included these tests from, translated it from English. In the test of the 1940s, it was a huge amount was regarding Sweden, but not so much anymore. So this ethical reasoning, it's not that rigorously tested or woven into the diagnostic assessment as it was today, back then, but it's still, I think that it still like highlights the problem that we can have some kind of covert areas still that are included in these assessments, and we need to look more into these, and we're gonna keep doing that. We're gonna have some more studies on these issues. But I will stop there, and thank you so much for your attention. And well, I'm gonna stop sharing now. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Malin. That was very, very interesting. And I also, one thing that struck me, this is perhaps more a comment than a question, but one thing that struck me is that, I mean, some of the things that you show is something that I would think they would look at in Victorian times, but we're talking the 1940s, right? You know, having good morals and not being lazy and being, and also the eugenics aspects of like measuring the body, and are you sort of, is your body like inferior, and is that a sign of inferior intelligence, etc.? And
yeah,
when are we rid of those aspects today, or I mean, you had a bit of that in your comments at the end, but how do you see this developing?
I think that this obsession with trying to see what is inside on the outside, it's always going to be alluring for us, I think, because it's hard to know what goes on in other person's brain. It's how well do they understand this? I mean, you can look at different kinds of intelligence testing or testing of autism spectrum disorders. Does this person understand this, or is this something learned, like mechanically learned? Can this person in front of me use this information adaptively in his or her everyday functioning, or is this just something that he or she has learned to say when getting this question? And when it comes to forensic psychiatric investigations, I mean, they are done today during 4 weeks if you are detained, but in the 1940s it could be over 6 months. So we have a hugely different time span on these, and sometimes it was just a few weeks there, but some of them were, I think we also have some kind of longer stays. I don't know if it's in this sample, but in the overall sample, definitely.
And you mentioned autism, which I also think is very, because I think a lot of the village idiots and the odd people, I mean, we've always had people on the autism spectrum. They just didn't have the tools to diagnose this. It's just something that is included today that is sort of taking into consideration, or is it only
I can say that the persons who, it's always very, very dangerous to diagnose backwards, so to speak. But if you, the persons with some of the violent offenders, not in this sample, which had a very high intellectual functioning, you could see some kind of clear indications that, okay, autistic traits at least, very, very good at thinking about this and very planning this and that, but not when it comes to the social aspects, and are described as, in the 1940s lingo, very, very odd, or socially awkward, or those kinds of terms that we don't use today when it comes to values, because we have been taught to think that we will not use value language when it comes to this. But in the 1940s, it's no such no such restrictions applied.
No, they didn't seem to have restrictions about how about these types of tests. I mean, were they also used, like, more generally, like to rate school children's development level, or in other situations apart from the criminal forensic discipline?
Yes, they were, and the intelligence test, a lot of them, it stems from school, how well you do in school. That is one, and I think that that is why we still have this focus on memory, and when it comes to knowledge, general knowledge, I think that is one explanation on why has it been so heavy, this focus, over so long time. When it comes to today's intelligence test, when you're supposed to use your utilize your logic patterns, those kinds of, you don't see any of that in the 1940s intelligence measurements, and those have kind of solid roots to the school area, like 50, or I think it was 100 children, that was the norm thing, and that was actually devised within a school setting. So
yeah, I know some of the original ones were, at least, but this battery is quite comprehensive. And I was also, I mean, I do read Swedish, and I was like, whoa, some of those written tests with completing the proverbs or the job, the level is quite high.
Yes, it's really high. And when I see them, they actually also write some things. My life story is actually a thing that they give to these inmates, and they're supposed to write their life story, and their handwriting is almost impeccable. It's like your motor skills. It's really, really, really good. And these are persons who are deemed severely intellectually disabled, and still has this very fine-tuned motor activity. So it's well, I don't know. It's really, they've been practicing a lot, I think.
Yes, of course, but still, well, at least the field is developing, and so that's good to know. I think I am out of questions now, but it was super interesting, and also for us here in Mensa, interesting to see, shall we say, the other end of the spectrum, but also the kinds of values and judgments that are put about on people's intelligence and the expressions of that intelligence. So I think it's a very interesting field to look into. So thank you very much for that.
I'm just going to say that we have two papers on this, that on the results of these talks that I've given now. So two papers are coming out, hopefully in the end of this year, and also we are looking into the higher end of the spectrum also, but that required another kind of analysis that needs to be made, because that is so much more diverse. So that is coming also. So I will keep you posted.
We will look forward to that and see. I mean, I think as far as I know, the criminal mastermind is a bit of a myth, but you never know. Maybe you'll find some. Anyways, I mean, I hope you'll keep us posted, and we will be very happy to get some links or something to the articles that are coming out, because I think probably people will be very interested. So what's in the future for you now? What's next? Are you continuing this kind of study, or do you have other interesting aspects coming up?
Well, this is part of a large project, and thanks to the Nordic Mensa Fund, we could do this, like delve into the intelligence concept, because that was something that we found was, okay, this is so important. We need to do this as a separate study, and thanks to you, we were able to do that.
Well, we're very happy that we made a difference.
You really did. And then we have a huge project on the decision making in forensic psychiatric investigations. And this, when it comes to the historical aspect, it helps us to illustrate what kind of historical bias are we carrying into our FPIs today, and how can we keep the personal values, the social cultural values that shouldn't be a part of these assessments, away from them as much as possible, at least. Of course, we are all living in social context, but the historical comparison makes it easier to spot these.
Yeah.
So, but we are doing studies on the current also.
Yeah, that's super interesting, because the historical record sort of holds up a mirror, because as you did in your conclusions, like you say that there are certain aspects of this testing that we find somewhat offensive now, or not, I mean, not good, but we still have elements, we still have some kind of legacy of that in the way we test today.
Yeah,
okay.
It could help us prune it.
Yeah, that would be great. Leonardo, if you're still there, maybe you'll join us also. Yay, there he is, because there was something I didn't ask you before, and that was also like, what's your next step? Where will you be taking your research from now on?
There are several different projects that we are planning to do. I think one thing that I want to do is going farther in studying aging, and possibly studying people over time. So with longitudinal designs, not just cross-sectional designs like this one, where we had young people and older adults, but following people over the years, and then see whether we can use musical memory paradigms and in general memory and intelligence scores and the neurobiology of that as a sort of biomarker for predicting their probability of developing dementia or in general cognitive decline. So that's one big step. Another big step is to go a bit farther into the basic science behind memory and hopefully intelligence as well, by integrating the techniques that we use now. So this magnetoencephalography and magnetic resonance imaging with intracranial recording. We have collaborators a little bit around the world who are collecting now some data while people did the same kind of tasks. And hopefully we can then get information within the brain specifically with invasive recordings, and then we can combine that with these whole brain investigations that we are doing at the moment in Denmark primarily. So those are the two main strands for my future.
Well, fantastic. We're looking forward to, and I guess also your field will also develop with like technical development, what we can actually, the devices that you can actually use to measure stuff, right?
Yes, of course. There is a continuous development of the technical devices, but also on the methodologies for data analysis. So yeah, we'll see what we'll manage to achieve.
Great. Well, I would like to thank both of you for very, very different subjects, but two very, very interesting presentations that show the breadth of what intelligence touches upon, or how we can discuss this subject. So thank you very much for today, and good luck with your research going forward. We would be very happy to hear from you, and we will also, whenever we get updates on articles published and stuff, we will be publishing them on our website. And to the listeners out there, I actually have no idea how many are here, but this will also be, the recording of this will be posted on our YouTube channel, so you can rewatch it or have your friends watch it. So it will be there for posterity. So I think I promised that I would share my share the information on how you could, how you could you know, contribute to the fund. So again, I'll just leave that here as the last conclusion for today. Thank you very much, and that's all for our Intelligence Day 2023 webinar. Goodbye, everyone, and thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.